The figure we are diving into today is, I mean, she's one of the foundational icons of American history, but the image we often carry, it's this idea of the kindly, brave conductor.
Yeah.
And that image, it really masks a revolutionary, a deeply complicated and profoundly effective military mind.
It really does.
So today we're taking a deep dive into the life of Harriet Tubman, and we're moving far beyond the Underground Railroad mythology to uncover the scout, the spy, the uncompromising warrior, and the woman who fought for compensation and dignity long after the war was even won.
And what's so great is that the sources we have now give us a truly comprehensive look. We can actually connect the dots between the early life trauma she suffered as Araminta Ross, as Minty, right? And then see her development into this religious mystic and revolutionary, and then her critical, even formal role as a Union military asset. This mission for us is really about understanding the full spectrum of her 90 years from, well, roughly March 1822 until 1913.
And when you just look at the list of her contributions, American abolitionist, social activist, nurse, suffragist, it's just overwhelming.
It is.
But today, we are really focusing on her operational genius. I mean, her work involved guiding enslaved people to freedom through 13 separate missions. 13. Rescuing approximately 70 individuals directly.
Directly. That's a key word.
And then providing explicit guidance to another 50 to 60. The success rate in an environment of total existential risk is it's unmatched.
And we really have to start by recognizing the absolute pinnacle of her operational career. I mean, our sources confirm this stunning piece of history that often just gets relegated to a footnote.
Right.
Tubman is widely credited as the first woman to lead an armed military operation in the United States. And this wasn't just participation.
Right.
This was leadership. It was command and strategy during the crucial Combahee River Raid of 1863.
Leadership that was fueled by success. The name that defines her, Moses. It stems directly from the results. She was the one leading people out of bondage in a way that just echoed the Old Testament narrative she held so dear.
Indeed. And her personal motto and claim, which, historians rely on heavily when discussing the operational success of the Underground Railroad, was that she never lost a passenger.
Never lost a passenger.
In all her journeys. And given the sheer difficulty, the psychological pressure, the constant threat of betrayal and capture, that claim just speaks volumes about her planning, her discipline, and, frankly, the ruthlessness she was willing to apply to ensure the group's safety.
Okay, so let's unpack the origins of this legend. We have to start in Dorchester County, Maryland. She was born Araminta Ross, or Minnick, to Rit Green and Ben Ross, who were both enslaved by the Bridas family.
Right.
But even just her birth date is shrouded in the obfuscation of the slavery system.
That's exactly right. For those born into bondage, precise records were rarely kept. Or if they were often based on economic value, not on, human record.
Of course.
Historians generally place her birth around March 1822, and that's based on scattered records like a payment to a midwife and then later runaway advertisements.
But the dates on her death certificate and her gravestone are all over the place.
All over the place. 1815, 1820, 1825. This uncertainty immediately illustrates how slavery just stripped away a fundamental right, the knowledge and documentation of your own existence.
And the threat to her existence and her family unit was immediate. It was constant. Her mother, Rit, was a cook for the Broaddus family, and she fought desperately to keep her 9 children together. But the system was just designed to destroy those bonds.
It was inevitable. 3 of her sisters, Lena, Mariah Ritty, and Sephora, were sold away. Just permanent separations that deeply scarred the family.
I can't even imagine.
When we think of Tubman's later dedication to her family, it's rooted right here in this traumatic experience of witnessing those losses. The knowledge that any day, any of them could be pulled away and sent south to the cotton fields. That was the central, unrelenting anxiety of their lives.
But there's a powerful, pivotal moment of defiance that really seems to have set a precedent for Tubman's own resistance. An anecdote involving her mother, Rit.
Oh, this story is incredible. Our sources detail this, and it must have been foundational to how Minty understood defiance. A slave trader from Georgia arrived, intending to buy Rit's youngest son, Moses.
Not her eventual husband, but a brother named Moses.
Right, her brother. Rit managed to hide him for an entire month, with help from others in the community. But when Edward Broaddus and the trader finally cornered her, Rit, a woman who supposedly had no power, she confronted them.
What did she do?
She physically stood between them and her child, and she proclaimed that if they dared enter her house, she would split his head open.
Wow.
And what's so fascinating here is that the resistance worked.
It worked.
Broadus, the enslaver, he actually backed away. He abandoned the sale because Writ presented such a credible threat of violence.
That's a crucial, tangible victory. It proves that resistance, even by the seemingly powerless, was possible and could, alter the system's calculus, if only temporarily.
It could. But Tubman's own childhood was defined not by victories, but by sustained brutality. I mean, she was hired out as a nursemaid as young as 5 or 6 years old.
Basically a disposable laborer,
Yeah.
and the treatment was just appalling.
Absolutely brutal. We know she was subjected to severe, repeated beatings. There's one recollection from her later life where she speaks of being lashed 5 times before breakfast on a single day.
5 times before breakfast.
Those scars, physical and emotional, she carried them throughout her life. Her attempts at resistance back then were small, but so resourceful, running away for short periods or wearing layers of thick clothing to try and cushion the force of the lashes.
But the defining moment, the experience that irrevocably changed her mind, her body, her spirit, that occurred in her adolescence, this severe traumatic head injury.
This is where it gets really interesting, because the physical violence of slavery literally rewrote her neurological state and her worldview.
How did it happen?
She was standing in a doorway when an overseer, furious that another enslaved man had attempted to flee, hurled a 2-pound metal weight that was intended for the runaway. It missed its target and struck Tubman directly on the head.
And she was left unconscious and bleeding. A devastating physical blow.
The neglect that followed the injury was just. It was criminal. She was laid on a rough loom seat for 2 days without any medical intervention whatsoever.
For 2 days.
She remained comatose for weeks, and the impact was permanent. For the rest of her life, she suffered from debilitating, painful headaches, chronic dizziness, and what observers just called seizures or spells.
And these spells included episodes of hypersomnia, right? That profound, uncontrollable urge to sleep.
Yes, often causing her to fall instantly and deeply unconscious, though she claimed that during these spells she was actually acutely aware of her surroundings.
Medically, historians often suggest the symptomology aligns with temporal lobe epilepsy, maybe narcolepsy, or possibly cataplexy, all conditions directly caused by that severe, blunt force trauma to her head.
The specific medical diagnosis is, of course, difficult to confirm retrospectively, but the fact remains her brain was permanently altered by that violence. And this physical trauma led directly to a profound spiritual shift.
This is the key. After the injury, she began experiencing vivid visions, intense dreams, auditory sensations,
which she immediately and unequivocally interpreted as divine premonitions and revelations from God.
So the pain, the seizures, the sensory overload, that became the engine of her faith. She wasn't simply a religious woman. She was a mystic who believed she was receiving direct, actionable instructions from God.
Precisely. She grew up absorbing Bible stories, mostly from the Old Testament, through her mother, and likely attended a Methodist church, but her faith became intensely passionate and radically non-passive.
Right, because the religion taught by white slave owners encouraged submission and obedience.
Exactly. Tubman drew on the Exodus story, the God of deliverance, and used her mystical inspiration as a guide. She came to see her own suffering and her subsequent visions as proof that she was chosen for a revolutionary purpose.
This fusion of physical resilience, this unending chronic pain, and this prophetic absolute certainty, it fundamentally shaped her revolutionary courage. And this spiritual evolution seems to coincide with her adopting a new name.
Yes, she changed her name from Araminta, or Minty, to Harriet. She adopted her mother's name, Writ, whose full name was reportedly Harriet, right around the time of her marriage or her escape. It was an act of honor and maybe a step toward embracing the destiny that the newly named Harriet would fulfill. It really marked the transition from the enslaved girl to the future conductor.
So the immediate catalyst for her own escape in 1849 was this chilling knowledge that her life was measured purely in economic terms.
Right. She had fallen ill yet again, probably exacerbated by her head injury, which diminished her value as property. Her enslaver, Edward Broadus, tried to sell her but failed to find a buyer immediately.
And this fear of being sold spurred that now famous episode of prayer.
It did. She prayed initially for Broadus to change his heart. But when that didn't happen, her prayer shifted dramatically. It reflected her new, uncompromising, Old Testament-inspired faith. She prayed, and I'm quoting here, "1st of March, I began to pray, 'Oh, Lord, if you ain't never going to change that man's heart, kill him, Lord, and take him out of the way.'"
And then Broadus died a week later.
A week later. For a woman who interpreted her headaches and dreams as direct divine communication, that event must have been the ultimate affirmation of her mission. It cemented her sense of destiny.
But his death actually created a more immediate, practical danger, didn't it?
It did. When an enslaver died, the estate had to be settled, which almost always meant the family and the enslaved people were sold off to pay debts. So this increased the probability that her remaining family would be scattered forever. Tubman realized she had to act immediately.
And she initially tried to leave with her husband, John Tubman, who was a free man, but he actively discouraged her.
He was afraid of the risks, but she rejected his fear, stating that creed that would define her life. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death.
She was absolutely resolved.
Completely. The first attempt, in September 1849, involved her brothers, Ben and Henry. But they lost their nerve shortly after leaving, likely out of fear for the wives and children they left behind, and they forced Minty to return with them.
That temporary failure only intensified her resolve.
It did. So the successful solo escape came shortly after, in October or November of 1849.
And how did she signal her intentions to the few people she trusted?
She relied on coded communication through song. She would quietly hum or sing spirituals to trusted members of the community, notably a friend named Mary. Her farewell song contained the clue, "I'll meet you in the morning, I'm bound for the promised land."
Such a subtle, beautiful way to communicate a massive, life-altering decision without alerting the overseers.
And that journey itself, nearly 90 miles by foot from Dorchester County, guided by the North Star, must have been an extreme test of endurance. We need to remember, this was a woman who suffered from chronic, agonizing headaches and possible seizures, walking through hostile territory.
It's an incredible feat of physical and mental resilience. The road took her through the difficult terrain of the eastern shore, traveling northeast along the Choptank River, then into Delaware, and finally crossing into Pennsylvania.
And she relied heavily on that informal, network-free and enslaved Black people and white abolitionists, particularly the Quakers in the Preston area, who risked everything by giving her shelter and aid.
And her description of finally crossing into freedom is just so evocative of the shift she experienced.
It was an epiphany for her. She recalled looking at her hands and questioning if she was the same person. She said, "There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven." It was a sense of ownership over her own existence she'd never known.
But that feeling of pure freedom was threatened almost immediately by changing federal law.
Oh, absolutely.
You're referring to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. How did that law change the operational environment for Tubman and the Underground Railroad?
Well, it made the North, even Pennsylvania, completely treacherous. The law essentially deputized federal law enforcement and even ordinary citizens to aid in the capture of fugitives, regardless of whether the state itself had outlawed slavery.
So freedom seekers could be legally seized and returned to the South from places like Boston or New York.
Exactly. This drastically shifted Tubman's operational scope. It forced her to guide travelers farther north, often all the way into British North America, specifically southern Ontario, which remained the only truly safe destination.
The danger was heightened, which means her tactical ingenuity had to increase tenfold. What were her specific strategies for evasion and secrecy?
She was a master of operational security and timing. For instance, she preferred working in the winter months.
Why winter?
Well, the nights were longer, offering more hours of cover. And the bitter cold helped dissuade general movement and reduce the likelihood of chance encounters. But most crucially, she often started her missions on Saturday evenings.
That timing detail, starting on a Saturday, that's the sort of operational planning that tells us she understood the mechanics of the opposition.
Oh, she viewed the press as part of the surveillance network. She knew that slave owners often placed runaway advertisements in local newspapers immediately. By starting on Saturday night, she and her passengers gained a critical 48-hour window before the newspapers could print those runaway notices on Monday morning.
Giving them a vital head start on the search parties.
A huge head start. And her use of disguise and psychology was equally effective. She utilized the societal assumptions about enslaved Black women as camouflage.
You have to tell us about the chickens.
The sources provide these two incredible examples of her subterfuge. Once, she disguised herself with an old bonnet and carried 2 live chickens. Upon realizing she was walking straight toward a former enslaver, she just yanked the strings holding the birds' legs, causing them to flap violently.
Brilliant.
The distraction was enough that the enslaver just glanced at her, saw a poor woman struggling with farm animals, and ignored her completely.
A perfect use of chaos and misdirection to avoid recognition.
And the second, equally powerful instance occurred on a train. She recognized a former enslaver sitting nearby. Knowing that she was illiterate, she quickly snatched a nearby newspaper and pretended to read it.
The enslaver, who would have been looking for a fugitive, likely dismissed her because the sight of a black woman reading a newspaper just defied his preconceived notions of who she was.
She was calculating the psychology of the oppressor. She was turning his own assumptions against him.
And the spirituals she used, like Go Down Moses, they were adapted specifically to communicate those operational shifts in the moment, weren't they?
Yes, the spirituals acted as a living code. They might signal that a safe house was clear, or conversely, that danger was ahead, requiring a change in route or a sudden retreat. And when a group successfully reached freedom, her customary exclamation was a profound affirmation of that faith. Glory to God and Jesus too. One more soul is safe.
Okay, let's discuss the most difficult moral aspect of her leadership. The extreme measures she took to ensure success. We know she carried a revolver.
Yes.
Primarily for protection against slave catchers, but also for her own passengers.
This is where the term uncompromising warrior truly applies. She made it absolutely clear. She threatened to shoot anyone in her group who tried to turn back.
And her logic was brutal but practical.
Completely. One person turning back out of fear or duress could be captured, tortured, and forced to betray the entire network. The routes, the safe houses, the identities of those who helped them.
So she forced resolve on the entire party to protect the fragile existence of the operation. Go on or die.
The sources suggest that while she was capable of immense empathy, her prophetic conviction just superseded that emotional burden. She believed she was enacting God's will. And in that framework, the risk of failure, the risk of dozens of people dying or being returned to bondage, that was a greater moral offense than forcing one fearful person forward.
And there are stories that confirm this.
There is one story that confirms her steadfastness. A man insisted on returning to the plantation. Tubman held the gun to his head, and days later, that same man successfully crossed into Canada with the rest of the group.
Her perfect record, never losing a passenger, is deeply intertwined with that uncompromising discipline.
It is.
Now, before we move on to her military service, we have to address the financial myth. This idea of a $40,000 bounty on her head is almost as famous as her name.
It's a classic example of historical hyperbole. It was propagated by later supporters, including her biographers, who wanted to dramatically underscore her value and the scale of her defiance.
So there's no documentation for that?
None. No documentation exists for a reward anywhere near $40,000, or even the $12,000 that was sometimes reported. The actual runaway notices for Minty and her brothers offered $100 for each of them.
$100 was significant, but it tells us the legendary threat level wasn't really reflected in the paper trail.
Correct. But the real numbers, they speak for themselves. Forget the mythic reward. Focus instead on the reality. 13 separate expeditions, rescuing approximately 70 people directly and guiding dozens more, all while remaining uncaptured. That is the true measure of her operational genius.
So the natural progression from this highly effective armed operative of the Underground Railroad was into direct conflict. And that shift seems to have been catalyzed by her meeting with John Brown in 1858.
Brown, who advocated for the violent overthrow of slavery, he immediately recognized her competence and ferocity. He was the one who first gave her that unofficial military title, calling her General Tubman.
And she was ready for his message.
Oh, absolutely. She claimed she had a prophetic vision of their meeting before it even happened, which, in her mind, affirmed his revolutionary path.
So she actively helped him plan and recruit for his mission.
Yes, leveraging her extensive network and her deep, intimate knowledge of the abolitionist and fugitive networks spanning the border states, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. She was instrumental in bringing former slaves living in southern Ontario into Brown's planned fighting force.
But she missed the actual 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry.
She did. She was ill in New Bedford, Massachusetts, but her support was unwavering even after his failure and subsequent execution.
She saw him as a martyr, not a failure.
Exactly. She famously said Brown done more in dying than 100 men would in living. For Tubman, who merged her spiritual beliefs with political action, Brown's sacrifice became this sacred act of revolutionary martyrdom. And this belief was important because at the same time, she was securing a physical base of operations for herself.
The 7-acre farm in Auburn, New York, which she purchased in 1859 from Frances Adeline Seward. That was an incredibly complex move, given her status as a fugitive.
It was complicated and very risky. The sale was technically illegal under federal law. However, the Sewards, that's the family of Senator William Seward, They managed the transaction carefully. They held the mortgage as a private arrangement and strategically delayed the official deed transfer.
And that act of abolitionist support provided Tubman with a crucial sanctuary.
It did, a place where she could finally bring her aging parents back from Canada to live permanently in the U.S., and a place that served as a safe haven for other Black Americans.
So when the Civil War erupted in 1861, how did she interpret the meaning of the conflict through her prophetic lens?
She saw it as divine intervention, a certainty that the war would inevitably lead to abolition. Her conviction was immediate. She volunteered for the Union cause in January 1862, traveling to Port Royal, South Carolina,
which was a crucial Union staging ground,
and home to vast encampments of newly escaped enslaved people, often called contraband. She initially served as a cook and a nurse.
And she wasn't shy about offering political critique to the Union leadership.
Not at all. She condemned President Lincoln's initial reluctance to make the war explicitly about ending slavery. Her critique was sharp and theologically grounded. God won't let Master Lincoln beat the South till he does the right thing.
She believed that by freeing and arming the enslaved, the Union could win quickly.
And save the lives of white soldiers who were dying needlessly. That was her argument.
Her nursing methods were also really resourceful, moving beyond official government supplies.
She was a folk healer. She had an intimate knowledge of local plants and prepared traditional remedies, which proved highly effective in treating soldiers suffering from infectious diseases common in camp, like dysentery.
And she rejected government rations entirely.
She did, to avoid any perception that she was benefiting unduly from the government. Instead, she earned her own money by making and selling pies and root beer in the evenings.
That's a fascinating detail. She's running a military intelligence operation during the day and a small business at night. The sheer exhaustion must have been unimaginable.
It speaks to her ceaseless drive. But her role changed fundamentally after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. She transitioned fully from a civilian nurse to an official military intelligence operative.
That's the key shift. How did her Underground Railroad experience translate into her new role as an armed scout and spy?
Perfectly. I mean, her decades of moving covertly through hostile terrain, her ability to memorize routes, her deep connections with enslaved people who remained behind Confederate lines, all of that made her invaluable. She was formerly working under the authority of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton.
She led a band of scouts.
Yes, mapping unfamiliar terrain, identifying Confederate logistical points, and gathering crucial strategic intelligence around the Port Royal region. Her work even aided Colonel James Montgomery in the temporary capture of Jacksonville, Florida in March 1863.
But the single greatest military action she led was the Combahee River Raid of June 1863. So take us through the operational details of that day.
All right. So Tubman guided 3 Union steamboats up the Combahee River, a crucial waterway in South Carolina's Low Country. Her specific knowledge of the river was critical because the Confederates had strategically placed mines, or torpedoes, in the water to sink Union vessels.
And she successfully guided the boats past these hidden dangers.
She did. Once past the mines, Colonel Montgomery's troops assaulted several major plantations along the riverbanks. The Union troops set fires, destroyed key Confederate infrastructure wharves, storehouses, rice mills, and seized supplies.
A significant logistical blow to the Confederate war effort in the region.
A huge blow. But the liberation was the lasting legacy.
Right, because Tubman's spy network had pre-warned the enslaved communities nearby.
They had. As the Union steamboats sounded their whistles, enslaved people realized this was their moment.
Yeah.
Over 700 individuals rushed to the riverbanks seeking freedom.
And Tubman personally went ashore to help manage the chaos.
Directing the newly liberated onto the boats. Armed overseers tried desperately to stop the flight, but they just failed against the speed and surprise of the raid.
700 people liberated in a single action. And over 100 of those newly freed men immediately joined the Union Army. That's a strategic win of staggering magnitude.
It's a phenomenal human and military success, and it cemented her recognition as the first woman to lead an armed military operation in the U.S. Though she held no official rank, her nickname, General Tubman, was widely used by the press and her colleagues.
And she ensured that the official reporting credited the bravery not just of Montgomery, but of the Black troops and scouts in his regiment.
She did. She later gave a historian this incredible, almost biblical description of the brutal reality of battle, describing the assault on Fort Wagner in July 1863.
I want to hear this.
She said, "We saw the lightning, and that was the guns, and then we heard the thunder, and that was the big guns, and then we heard the rain falling, and that was the drops of blood falling, and when we came to get the crops, it was dead men that we reaped." She continued her service, nursing the wounded, for 2 more years, until several months after the Confederacy surrendered in April 1865.
So after 3 years of monumental, life-risking, service-guiding military vessels, scouting enemy lines, nursing the sick and wounded, Tubman received almost nothing.
Little to no official compensation. Our sources indicate she received a total of only $200 for those 3 years.
$200.
Her status was largely unofficial, making it nearly impossible to document her service to the U.S. government, and this condemned her to constant poverty for the rest of her life.
That administrative injustice, the failure to recognize her formal military contributions, it's shocking. But the indignity she faced didn't stop at bureaucracy. It was physical and personal, exemplified by that horrific 1865 train incident.
This incident is such a stark reminder that military service did not erase the reality of post-war racism. She was traveling home on a half-fare ticket granted specifically because of her service. When a conductor demanded she move from the regular passenger car to the smoking car, she refused, asserting her right as a veteran.
And she physically resisted, didn't she?
She did. The conductor became abusive, cursing her, grabbing her. When she resisted forcefully, he called for assistance. They physically dragged her out of the seat and muscled her into the smoking car, injuring her in the process.
And the worst part is what the other passengers did.
The source material confirms that the white passengers did not come to her aid. Instead, they cursed her and cheered on the assault. Some even yelled for the conductor to physically kick her off the train. She returned home, General Tubman, physically assaulted and publicly humiliated because of the color of her skin.
That is just a profound tragedy, a complete betrayal of her service.
It is.
So back in Auburn, she settles into what was still a life dedicated to community. She took in boarders. She supported her parents on this meager income. In 1869, she found some stability, marrying Nelson Davis, a former enslaved man, and Civil War private who was significantly younger than her.
And they adopted a baby girl, Gertie, in 1874.
But even with that support, the poverty was grinding, and it made her desperate, leading to one of the most tragic episodes of her later life, the swindle of 1873.
The story of the trunk of gold.
Right. Given her history as this highly intelligent operative, how could she have been lured into such a scheme?
The context is crucial here. She was approached by 2 men claiming they knew of a former slave who had escaped South Carolina with a trunk full of gold coins. Now, during the Civil War, many wealthy white families in the South had buried valuables to keep them from Union troops, and black men were often tasked with the digging.
So the claim that a former slave had recovered a trunk seemed plausible to her.
It did, and she was deeply desperate for money to maintain her home and care for her family.
So believing this might be her only way to achieve financial security, she borrowed money from a wealthy friend to purchase this trunk.
Exactly. She arranged a meeting for a late-night transaction, but it was a setup. She was lured into the woods where she was violently assaulted, knocked unconscious with chloroform, and robbed of the money she had borrowed.
And the trunk?
When they finally found the trunk, it contained nothing but rocks. It was a vicious crime committed against a national hero.
It's just gut-wrenching. But ironically, that public humiliation and the news coverage of the swindle drew attention back to her neglected military service, forcing local leaders and politicians to finally try and secure her some form of compensation.
The irony is powerful. In 1874, a bill was finally introduced in the United States Congress, specifically seeking a $2,000 lump sum payment for her years of service as a scout, nurse, and spy. The attempt was serious, backed by her network of prominent abolitionist friends.
And did Congress approve the payment?
No, it was defeated in the Senate. The political landscape of the post-Reconstruction era was hardening against official recognition and financial support for black veterans, especially those who had performed unofficial roles.
So the government wanted to acknowledge nursing, which was seen as a charitable, appropriate role for a woman, but not armed espionage or scouting.
That's it. That crossed institutional, gender, and racial boundaries.
So, after the swindle and the failed congressional bill, what was the actual final outcome of her decades-long fight for a military pension?
The compensation she finally received was piecemeal and conditional. It began in 1895 when she was granted a widow's pension of $8 per month, and that was based solely on the service of her late husband, Nelson Davis, a Civil War private. Not her own.
Not her own.
4 years later, after relentless lobbying, Congress finally approved a compromise. This compromise raised her monthly payment to $20. But even this was carefully categorized. It was the original $8 for being a widow, plus $12 for her service as a nurse.
The distinction is critical. They refused to acknowledge the scouting and spy work.
They did. Congress never officially recognized her contributions as an armed scout and spy in the military records during her lifetime. It was a painful, institutional dismissal of her revolutionary effectiveness in the field. She was, in the government's eyes, a widow and a nurse roles deemed acceptable, but never the General Tubman who led men into battle.
And beyond these battles for financial security, she found time to fight for the future of all women, becoming active in the women's suffrage movement alongside leaders like Susan B. Anthony.
Her presence in the suffrage movement was profoundly impactful. She would stand before audiences and describe her wartime actions and her life of sacrifice, asking the audience to judge her capabilities against those of men.
And when asked directly if women should vote,
her response just perfectly encapsulated her life. I suffered enough to believe it. She felt that her physical and existential sacrifice had earned her the franchise, and by extension, all women deserved it. She used her experiences as concrete proof that women were not simply passive citizens.
She also established a major piece of her local legacy in Auburn, the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged.
She deeded her property to the AME Zion Church in 1903, and it officially opened in 1908. She was immensely proud of it, seeing it as a realization of her lifelong commitment to the most vulnerable.
But she was quickly frustrated by the church's financial necessities.
Right, specifically their rule requiring a $100 entrance fee for new residents. Her original vision was far more radical.
She didn't want any barriers to entry, did she?
Her commitment to the destitute was absolute. She stated clearly that she wanted the rule to be that nobody should come in unless they didn't have no money at all. It shows that even in her retirement, her instincts remained focused on providing absolute charity and refuge, a continuation of the mission that began on the Underground Railroad.
And even as she provided care for others, her own physical health was failing her, haunted by the violence of her youth. The lifelong pain from that head injury became unbearable.
The symptoms, the crushing headaches, and the constant buzzing she reported in her head, they became debilitating toward the turn of the century. In the late 1890s, she sought surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital, and she gave a harrowing description of the procedure. The doctor sawing open her skull to relieve the pressure and pain.
And the incredible detail that accompanies this surgery, a detail that just perfectly summarizes her life as a warrior.
It's tragic and profoundly symbolic. She reportedly received no anesthesia for this extremely painful procedure. Instead, she bit down on a bullet, mimicking the action she had seen Civil War soldiers perform during amputations.
It was her final act of endurance.
Meeting her physical pain with the grit and discipline of a hardened soldier, she died of pneumonia on March 10, 1913, surrounded by friends and family. Her last quoted words were from the Gospel of John, an affirmation of her enduring faith. "I go away to prepare a place for you."
Her impact was recognized immediately upon her death, though. She was buried with semi-military honors at Fort Hill Cemetery, and her stature has only grown in the decades since, solidifying her place as one of the most famous figures in American history.
Inspiring generations of civil rights leaders. And the tangible honors they continue to accumulate, recognizing her diverse contributions. We see national parks and historical sites dedicated to her in Maryland and New York. She broke barriers, even posthumously, becoming the first African-American woman honored on a U.S. postage stamp in 1978.
And the modern recognition is strong. In 2024, the U.S. Mint issued commemorative coins depicting her various stages of life: the conductor, the soldier, the humanitarian.
But perhaps the most visible and widely discussed symbol of her enduring legacy is the ongoing plan to feature her portrait on the front of the $20 bill, replacing Andrew Jackson.
Who was an enslaver himself.
Right. And perhaps the most fitting, if long overdue, acknowledgement came recently in 2024. The ultimate military honor that official records denied her in life.
What was that?
She was posthumously commissioned as a one-star general in the Maryland National Guard. It is a powerful official recognition of her Civil War service as a scout and spy, the very contribution that Congress dismissed and refused to pay for during her lifetime. This delayed honor finally rectifies that historical oversight.
But her story also gives us a crucial lesson in historiography, how history is actually created and passed down, especially for an individual who was illiterate and couldn't write her own memoirs.
This is a critical point for a deep dive audience. For decades, the public's understanding of Tubman was filtered almost entirely through the lens of early authorized biographies. Specifically, Sarah Hopkins Bradford published two key works in 1869 and 1886.
And Bradford took significant artistic license.
A lot. She wasn't seeking objective truth. She was primarily trying to raise money for Tubman and make her story palatable to white abolitionists and religious audiences.
So she essentially created a persona for the public to digest.
Precisely. Bradford portrayed her less as a nuanced, complex woman and more as a moralistic figure, a latter-day Joan of Arc. While these books preserved her memory, they often dramatized events and suppressed the more difficult realities, like her violent resistance, her political critiques, the true extent of her medical condition, all to fit a narrative of saintly heroism.
So the objective truth, the full historical picture, remained largely obscured by this romanticized version for a long time.
A very long time. It wasn't until Earl Conrad, an academic, published his work in 1943 that the first full biography based on rigorous objective academic research appeared. And he reportedly struggled for 4 years just to find a publisher willing to take on a serious, complex look at her life.
Which demonstrates how firmly entrenched that simplified moralistic narrative was in the American consciousness.
Exactly. It has taken academic work since the mid-20th century to synthesize the identity we now recognize.
The identity of a religious mystic whose visions were likely fueled by severe trauma, a phenomenally skilled and uncompromising military operative of the Underground Railroad, and an unyielding warrior for justice whose fight for dignity continued long after the official conflict ended.
That's the woman.
So this deep dive has truly taken us from Araminta Minty Ross, the enslaved girl profoundly scarred by physical violence, all the way to Moses, the resourceful conductor, and finally to General Tubman, the military intelligence operative.
It's an incredible arc.
The core insight remains this intrinsic link between her trauma and her revolutionary courage. Her unwavering faith, arguably intensified by her head injury, was the psychological engine that drove the discipline, ensuring that perfect record. She truly never lost a passenger.
And for you, the listener, understanding her post-war life is essential to understanding the full scope of American freedom. The shift in narrative from victory to this exhausting fight for recognition, the brutal train assault, the calculated swindle, the decades-long battle for a proper military pension. It reveals that the battle for dignity and institutional recognition often continues long after official freedom is declared.
It does.
Her relentless pursuit of compensation shows she understood the material value of her sacrifice, even if the government would only recognize the acceptable roles of nurse and widow.
It's a powerful lesson in who gets paid for heroism and whose sacrifice is simply expected.
Which brings us to our final thought for you to consider. We have detailed how Tubman's most effective tactics, both in escape and in military intelligence, involved blending in, using subterfuge, and appearing harmless carrying agitated chickens pretending to read, using the assumed illiteracy of a black woman as camouflage.
What?
Given the constant mortal threat of capture she faced across 13 missions, how might this mastery of deception honed by the very system that oppressed her have been her most powerful and enduring weapon? Was she primarily a mystic guided by God, or was she a brilliant strategist who successfully convinced her enemies to underestimate her until the very moment she struck?